All this is Ben Domenech, editor-at-large at The Spectator, World and Fox News contributor, and Steve Forbes, Forbes media chairman and editor-in-chief. Good to see you both, gentlemen. Ben, first to you. 2 hours. We're supposed to get this vote this morning. It looked very bad. Apparently, Donald Trump has been on the phone all day with some of the recalcitrant Republicans. What are you hearing?
Well, what I'm hearing, frankly, is, more of the same in terms of the frustrations of a lot of these fiscal hawks who, within the House, have really, tried to work over the years to get anything in terms of the kind of cuts to government that we've seen them try and fight for in the past. But as you know, this is a situation where a sclerotic Congress that has been incapable of dealing with the budget resolutions in any kind of normal order without these kind of big bills that have to punt everything, avoid making any tough decisions. That's what brought us to the point where we have this, who let the Doge out period of this current presidential tenure, which is the only way to cut now is apparently to work through the executive, to target these probationary hires and to go after various programs in that way. And it's really an indictment of the way that things are supposed to work within a functioning democracy.
Well, Steve, I want to talk about taxes, because if we're going to grow the economy, which is the only way that we're going to get real money in people's pockets as opposed to the monopoly money that was passed out during Biden, we got to extend those tax cuts. If we don't do so by the end of this year, we're going to have a huge tax hike.
Oh, not just a tax hike, but a very nice recession going into the midterm elections.
Which means Republicans would lose the House and the Senate, and you'd have a lame duck for Donald Trump's second 2 years.
The 2017 tax cuts also included a provision of instant write-off of investments, but was phased out over several years, now down to zero. Businesses are wondering, is that going to be included in this new tax bill? If it isn't, you're going to see real CapEx spending devastated in this country, and companies need a decision now. They're starting to plan for the future, and that's why they cannot continue to punt on this thing. And also in terms of the tax cuts themselves, I know this is just a framework, but they got to get imaginative and reduce income tax rates, especially for middle-income people. The big thing for the blue states, SALT, 22, 24% tax brackets. Right. You reduce those two down to 15, they get a tax cut without even raising the deduction. So that's the kind of, and capital gains. What's their allergy to capital gains? Instantly raise revenue. So let's get through this first step. But if they don't get a big, nice, beautiful tax bill soon, we're going to be in trouble.
And just to Steve's point, do not sort of escape the notion that these Democrats are doing something on behalf of the people that they're claiming to be working for. They're doing this entirely because they believe that if this just sinks in the water, if this sinks in the swamp, then they will be advantaged when it comes to the midterms that you mentioned. They are doing this for aggressively and blatant, pure political self-interest.
Surprise, from DC politicians.
I mean, we're used to it. We're used to it by now. We've seen it happen time and again. But don't have any illusions that they're actually representing the people.
Steve, how can these blue state Republicans, like Congressman Lawler, for example, who's been very vocal about all this, how can they get a deal with Texans and Floridians who say, look, I don't want to pay for bad taxing in New York and California?
You do it by reducing tax rates. So that way, on the federal level, that means if you earn more, you have the incentive to earn more instead of a deduction. It's one thing to take away, David, the SALT deduction, but they forgot the other half, which is slashing tax rates. Yeah. So you don't have this constant pressure of trying to get rid of the thing. So instead of raising it to 30,000, 100,000, whatever number they're talking about, cut the tax rates, especially the middle income ones, so they can't say it's for the rich. So cut it to 15, and don't care what the CBO. The CBO is not in the Constitution. Republicans don't have to pay attention to it and shouldn't.
But Ben, what about a plan B, which Ron Johnson has talked about in the Senate, saying we're not going to open up another can of worms. We're going to focus on just extending the tax cuts that exist right now and get into all the other stuff a little later.
Look, I think that idea had its day. It was argued behind the scenes quite a lot, but the president has decided on this course. And look, what Donald Trump wants to do when it comes to the tactics of the Republican Party, that is the marching orders. And it's been true across the board in these opening days. And look, I think this is really important, not just for the midterms that we discussed, but to make sure that you have a firm foundation going forward for this presidency, because he has a limited window here to get so many different aspects of policy done. It's a very ambitious agenda, and getting this taken care of in a quick and smooth way is something that is a challenge for this current House leadership, but they're going to have to meet it in order to deliver.
We'll talk about challenges. We want to switch to foreign issues for a second, Steve, which is the news that there may be a deal between Zelensky and the United States on a minerals deal, getting some payback for U.S. taxpayers who poured in hundreds of billions of dollars in Ukraine. Do you see any sign of light at the end of the Ukrainian tunnel?
Well, the key is going to be in the details. On that mineral agreement, for example, 60% of Ukraine's minerals are now in Russian-occupied territory. How are they dealing with that?
Right.
So get a mineral deal done. But then the big question, which everyone rightly raises, how do you guarantee Ukrainian independence and sovereignty with a deal? And that's going to require, sadly, boots on the ground from the Europeans, tripwire. And also, I think it's ultimately going to require the United States having a big base in Poland, where if something goes wrong, we can immediately respond. And one thing I hope they'll go, especially the Europeans will relent on, is using the $300 billion of frozen assets from the Russians and use that for reconstruction and paying going forward. So $300 billion, start putting that to work.
By the way, very
instead of the
quickly,
American taxpayer.
you mentioned increase of forces in Poland. For decades now, going back to the Cold War, we've had tens of thousands of troops in Germany. Is it time to move them from Germany to
should
Poland?
have been done years ago. Poland is the center of Europe.
Just one more quick point. The fact of the matter is that Europe has fallen so far behind when it comes to maintaining their own defenses and their defense posture. I don't think that people truly understand how much they have shrunk their forces. The entire Royal Navy of the United Kingdom could not fill the stadium at Annapolis at the Naval Academy in America.
Wow.
Think about that for a second. They once ruled the seas, and now they have nothing approaching even 30,000 members of the Royal Navy. That's something that has to change. We have to have these European nations stand up, rebuild their own defense forces in order to have the kind of guard against exactly the kind of encroaching that you're guarding.
And we should use Finland and Sweden and Poland and the Baltic states, which are in effect the front lines against Russia these days, as the head of the spear, because they know what the threat is. They're building their militaries, and then bring the French and British along.
You know, this leads to the meltdown of the Euros that are in power right now.
Yes.
They might not be in power much longer, the way things are going. We saw the German elections. There's all kinds of pushback on their immigration policies, the green energy that hasn't panned out for them. So, I mean, how long can we wait for them to change before we can make a deal?
This whole moment is an indictment of the Eurocrat agenda.
Exactly.
Going back for years and years.
I would say the socialist Eurocrat ventures.
And that, to me, is something that it's long overdue, but it's very healthy. And I think voters are demanding change. But those changes need to happen more rapidly because there is too much risk.
You know how it's going to happen? If the U.S. succeeds.
Yeah.
Just as when Reagan succeeded, 50 countries cut their tax rates, which they never would have done without his lead. If America gets it right, Europe will be forced to get it right.
Leadership matters. It sends a signal throughout the world, and you are completely right. And the truth is that I think there is a cascade effect from what's been going on. And I have to say, I'm so impressed with particularly the vice president's performance during all of this. I think he has an understanding of this that is truly grounded in the information that we have learned over the last several years that speaks to the people and to a generation of people who say, we need to learn lessons from this and not just wander through things with a fanciful attitude.
What about Secretary Rubio? He has pushed back on Zelensky recently. Zelensky said he wanted access to nuclear weapons if, in fact, he wasn't allowed to join NATO. Rubio pushed back on that right away. He said we need fewer nuclear weapons in the world, not more. There was also the UN decision. You know, there was that vote. A lot of neoconservatives have pushed back on that, saying because essentially Trump said no to the idea of giving Zelensky more rope in the fight, and they wanted to condemn Russia, and the U.S. didn't want to condemn Russia as being part of the invasion in the first place. What about institutions like the UN? Is it time to depart from those institutions?
We ignore the UN, and I believe we shouldn't have given Russia a pass on that. They were bad in 2022 very bad in history. But the key thing is going forward is how do you make sure you get a durable deal? And in terms of what Zelensky's doing, I think he was trying to put something big on the table to negotiate. Remember, Ukraine had nuclear weapons to 1994. They gave them up with the British guaranteed the U.S. and the Brits that we'd come to their aid if Russia went after them. Obviously, that never happened, so they felt betrayed. So I think that was just a negotiating tactic, just as his invasion of the Kursk region in Russia was a bargaining chip to go on the table when they decide on how the new lines are going to be drawn in Ukraine.
Ben, are you worried? Were you worried when you saw that UN vote that this administration might be patronizing Russia in some way?
I don't think so. I think that the president understands what is important and what isn't when it comes to negotiations. I think we've seen it happen time and again. He understands when to use carrots and when to use sticks. And I think this is a situation where, as Steve said, there are different negotiation tactics that you're going to have to use during the course of this. But from my perspective, the catastrophizing that we are hearing from some of the neoconservative elements that now inhabit the Democratic Party is just completely at odds with what we've actually seen to this point, which is a lot of smart people I think he's brought into the administration.
I'll talk about a lot of smart people. We got two of them right here on the set here. And by the way, if we can get a close-up of this, can we do that? This is the new Spectator magazine. It's wonderful. I was telling you, the first money I ever got in journalism was from the American Spectator.
I appreciate it.
And I was about 20 years old for a book review. So
I'll have to look up the review.
All right. Thank you very much.